When I first bought the lake house, I didn't want trouble. I wanted peace. I wanted mornings spent sipping coffee as the mist curled off the water, the soft rocking of my boat lapping against the dock, the sound of birds greeting the day in a quiet symphony. The dock was my sanctuary, a custom build I had paid extra for, reinforced beams, stainless steel cleats, and an electric hoist system for my boat that made launching and docking effortless. It was, in every way, a dream come true. The only blemish on my personal paradise was the HOA, an overzealous group of clipboard warriors determined to regulate everything from mailbox colors to the number of ducks you could feed. Karen was their queen, a woman so deeply committed to control that it seemed she spent more time patrolling the neighborhood than living her own life. At first, I thought I could coexist peacefully. I smiled when I passed her, nodded politely during HOA meetings, and even agreed to her first few petty demands. Things like moving my trash bin 6 inches to the left or trimming a tree limb that supposedly blocked the sight line of the communal flower bed. But it didn't stop. Karen saw my compliance as weakness, and the dock became her obsession. It was too big, too modern, too mine. She hated that I had built it without community input, even though my lot was grandfathered into older zoning regulations that gave me total freedom over my shoreline. She hated the solar lights that lined it, claiming they caused light pollution and disturbed the local owls. She hated the tasteful nameplate I installed, Dock of Dreams, because she thought it encouraged individualism over community values. Her words, not mine. The boat itself, a sleek midnight blue cruiser named Lake Escape, became a symbol of rebellion in Karen's eyes. It wasn't just a boat. It was a floating reminder that someone in her HOA fiefdom could live without her approval. She began her campaign slowly, citing me for imaginary violations, sending me passive-aggressive emails about maintaining a harmonious lakeside aesthetic, and encouraging neighbors to lodge complaints about everything from the inappropriate reflection off my boat's polished hull to the excessive rippling my wake supposedly caused when I cruised in at dusk. None of it stuck. Every complaint was brushed aside by county officials because, legally, I was untouchable. But if there's one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was being told no. She started ramping up her efforts, petitioning the HOA board to impose new rules about dock uniformity. At meetings, she would veer off agenda topics and launch into thinly veiled attacks about how certain individuals were disrupting the lake's natural beauty with unsanctioned private developments. I'd sit there, sipping lukewarm coffee out of a paper cup, staring at her with a calm that I knew infuriated her. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I just waited. Because the thing about people like Karen is that they can't help but escalate, and the bigger they push, the bigger the mess they create for themselves. Behind the scenes, I fortified my position. I gathered every permit, every zoning document, every legal receipt that proved my dock and boat were fully compliant. I recorded HOA meetings. I saved every email. If Karen wanted a war, I was quietly, methodically building my arsenal. I thought she'd eventually give up. After all, most bullies do when their punches keep landing on iron walls. But Karen wasn't most bullies. She was a hurricane of entitlement wrapped in and tailor blazer. And one crisp October morning, as the leaves turned gold and the lake mirrored the cloudless sky, she crossed a line that would ignite a battle the likes of which our sleepy little lake town had never seen. It started with a noise, an unfamiliar clanking and scraping down by the water. I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, and stared in disbelief. A tow truck, of all things, was parked at the edge of the community boat launch. 2 men in greasy overalls were rigging up cables, and at the other end of those cables, my boat. Lake Escape bobbed helplessly as they maneuvered to haul her away. My dock creaked ominously under the strain. I dropped my mug, coffee exploding across the deck, and sprinted down the hill toward the water, rage boiling under my skin. Karen stood nearby, arms folded, an 808 clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield of righteousness. "This is private property," I shouted, my voice carrying across the lake. Karen didn't flinch. She smiled, a smug, infuriating smile that told me she thought she had finally won. She held up a piece of paper and said, "We voted. Your boat's a violation of community standards. We're removing it for the good of the neighborhood." My hand shook, not with fear, but with a cold, precise clarity that only comes when you know you are about to absolutely destroy someone. I told the tow guys to stop. They looked uncertain, glancing between me and Karen, but Karen barked, "You have authorization. Proceed." One of them shrugged and tightened the winch. I didn't fight them physically. I didn't need to. I pulled out my phone and started recording, narrating every illegal second as Karen's HOA-sanctioned goons violated private property laws, state boating regulations, and about 6 different municipal codes. I captured her smirking face. I captured the tow truck's license plate. I captured everything. They hauled Lake Escape away, with Karen watching triumphantly, unaware that she had just lit the fuse on the biggest mistake of her self-righteous life. As the tow truck disappeared around a bend, I turned to Karen, smiled back at her with all the venomous politeness I could muster, and said, "Congratulations, Karen. You just messed with the wrong guy." That night, I sat at my desk with a whiskey in one hand and my lawyer's number dialed in the other. Karen thought this was over. She thought she'd finally crushed the last independent spirit on her little lake. But what she didn't know, what she could never have anticipated, was that I wasn't just going to sue. I wasn't just going to fight back. No, I was going to change the game entirely. If Karen wanted to control the lake, she'd have to deal with the fact that soon enough, I would own the lake and everything on it. The next morning, I woke to a gnawing emptiness. The kind that comes when you know someone has violated your world and thinks they got away with it. The dock looked naked without Lake Escape tied securely to it, like a knight stripped of its armor. I stood on a porch, coffee untouched in my hand, staring at the empty mooring as the sun burned mist off the lake. That's when I noticed the note taped to my mailbox, a smug little letter from the HO, signed by Karen herself. It read, "Dear resident, due to repeated violations of community water aesthetics and unapproved vessel storage, your boat has been temporarily impounded. Please contact HOA Compliance Officer Karen, redacted last name, for retrieval terms." I read it 3 times, each word more absurd than the last. Compliance Officer. Who gave her that title? Herself, probably. I called a number listed, unsurprised when Karen answered on the first ring. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of fake nice that made my skin crawl. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she chirped. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Where's my boat?" I asked. Her smile practically came through the phone line. "Oh, it's safely stored. We'll be happy to discuss its return once you've agreed to the community's new dock compliance agreement." She sent over the so-called agreement within minutes, an amateur legal Frankenstein's monster of restrictions, maximum boat size, mandatory HOA inspections, permission slips for dock modifications, and this one made me laugh out loud, a $500 monthly lake maintenance fee. It wasn't just control she wanted. It was ransom. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Rick, my lawyer, the same bulldog who helped me win the first dock battle. Rick almost dropped his coffee when I forwarded him the note and the agreement. "This isn't just illegal," he said. "It's Olympic-level stupid." Within 2 hours, Rick filed a lawsuit demanding the immediate return of my boat, damages for illegal seizure of private property, and punitive sanctions against the HOA. But I didn't stop there. No, if Karen wanted a war, I was ready to scorch the earth. While the legal gears ground slowly toward inevitable victory, I started doing homework. I dove deep into county land records, HOA charters, and property ownership maps. That's when I stumbled onto something incredible. The lake wasn't public property. It wasn't technically owned by the HOA either. It was privately held by an elderly couple who lived 2 towns over. They leased the lake access to the HOA under a 30-year agreement that was, hilariously, due to expire within 6 months. Even better, their kids had zero interest in maintaining the property and were already quietly fielding offers. An idea sprouted, dark and delicious. Karen wanted to control the lake. Fine. I'd buy it out from under her. But before I could pull the trigger on that plan, I needed my boat back. So I played along. I attended the emergency HOA meeting Karen hastily called to resolve the lake incident. It was held at the community clubhouse, a beige soul-sucking rectangle of a building that smelled like burnt coffee and resentment. Karen stood at the front like a queen addressing her subjects, her clipboard clutched like a scepter. I walked in late, wearing sunglasses and a smile, and took a seat in the back. She droned on about upholding standards and protecting property values, pretending this was about the greater good and not her personal vendetta. When she opened the floor to comments, I raised my hand. "Just one question," I said. "What gives the HOA the authority to tow privately owned property from privately owned docks?" Karen's smile flickered, just for a moment. "Under the revised dock compliance agreement, An agreement," I interrupted. "That isn't legally binding without unanimous consent and wasn't voted on properly. And even if it were, it couldn't retroactively apply to property developed under grandfathered zoning exemptions." Rick had prepped me well. Karen's face went pink. "We're just trying to protect the community," she snapped. I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch. Every eye in the room was on me. "You didn't protect the community," I said. "You stole private property. And you're about to find out how expensive that mistake is." I left the meeting before she could respond. It wasn't about convincing her anymore. It was about laying the groundwork. A week later, Rick filed a motion for emergency relief. A county judge reviewed the evidence, the recordings, the emails, the impound notice with Karen's signature, and ordered the immediate return of Lake Escape along with $25,000 in damages to cover legal fees, lost usage, and punitive fines for the HOA's illegal actions. Karen tried to spin it, of course. She claimed it was a misunderstanding, that the HOA had acted in good faith. Nobody believed her. Neighbors who once feared her started giving her side eye at the mailbox. Rumors flew. Someone started an anonymous neighborhood newsletter called Karen's Court, mocking her every move. The HOA board meetings turned into shouting matches. And through it all, I stayed quiet, smiling, waiting. Because the real storm hadn't hit yet. The boat came back 2 days later, delivered sheepishly by a local towing company. I inspected it thoroughly, filmed the whole process, and signed the release with exaggerated care. Lake Escape was fine, save for a small scuff on the hull. Yet another detail we added to the damages claim. Karen didn't show her face that day. Smart. She must have sensed the tide turning, the undertow pulling her carefully constructed empire straight toward the rocks. That night, as I sat on the dock under a sky full of stars, I opened my laptop and typed up an email. Not to Rick, not to the HOA, but to the owners of the lake, the elderly couple whose name was quietly printed on a deed older than most of the houses around it. I made them an offer, full purchase price, cash, no contingencies. Their reply came the next morning. They were intrigued. Karen thought taking my boat would break me. She thought cutting off my access to the lake would bring me to heel. But she didn't realize that some men don't bow when you take their boat. They just buy the entire damn lake instead. The morning after my offer was accepted, the air around the lake smelled sweeter. Or maybe that was just the scent of inevitable victory. I didn't immediately tell anyone about the lake purchase negotiations. Some cards need to be played close to the chest. Meanwhile, the lawsuit against the HOA moved full steam ahead. Rick, my lawyer, relished the opportunity. "It's like Christmas came early," he said, grinning as he handed me a thick packet of discovery demands. Karen's unauthorized boat seizure had kicked off a legal domino effect, exposing a wide network of HOA misdeeds, forged votes, fabricated violation notices, misuse of community funds. It was so much worse than I'd imagined, and so much better for me. Karen tried every trick in the book to wriggle out of it. She begged for mediation, blamed clerical errors, even cried crocodile tears about being overwhelmed by community responsibilities. None of it mattered. The court wasn't sympathetic. Neither were the neighbors, who by now were whispering about Dockgate and how Karen had single-handedly turned the HOA into a laughingstock. Every email, every half-baked violation, every desperate move she had made was now evidence stacked high against her. The final board meeting before the trial was legendary. They held it in the same soulless clubhouse where Karen had once declared herself queen of lakefront compliance. Now, she looked like a dethroned monarch trying to fend off a revolution. The room was packed, standing room only. I walked in with Rick and Greg, my neighbor-turned-partner in rebellion, taking front row seats like we were at a fireworks show. Karen stood at the podium, papers trembling in her hands, trying to push through an emergency vote to authorize a special HOA fund to cover her legal defense. The room exploded. Neighbors shouted her down. "Why should we pay for your mess, Karen? You stole his boat. We're not funding your personal vendetta." One woman, Martha, who once got cited for having a pink flamingo in her garden, stormed the podium and slapped the microphone out of Karen's hand. It was chaos. Glorious, righteous chaos. Karen tried to gavel the meeting back to order, but someone had hidden the gavel. Someone else unplugged the PA system. A few residents started a slow clap every time she opened her mouth. I sat back, arms folded, and soaked in the spectacle. Rick leaned over and whispered, "This is better than Netflix." Karen finally fled the room, booed out by the very people she had once terrorized with HOA citations and passive-aggressive emails. The board meeting dissolved into an unofficial referendum. A motion was made to suspend Karen from her duties pending a full audit. It passed unanimously. Even Denise, her second-in-command, abandoned ship, mumbling something about personal health concerns and sliding toward the exit like a guilty raccoon. The lawsuit settlement negotiations began the next morning. Karen, for all her bravado, was desperate to avoid a full trial. Public embarrassment, financial ruin, possible criminal charges. It was all on the table. Rick and I sat across from her and her red-faced lawyer in a stuffy conference room. Karen looked 10 years older, the fire in her eyes snuffed out. I could have been merciful. I could have agreed to a quiet settlement with modest damages. But Karen didn't deserve mercy. She deserved a lesson she'd never forget. We demanded full reimbursement for the boat damage, punitive damages for illegal towing, attorney's fees, and a public apology letter to be distributed to every HOA resident. Karen's lawyer balked. Karen wept. Rick shrugged. Take it or leave it. See you in court. In the end, they caved. Karen signed everything. Her lawyer muttered something about malpractice insurance and left without shaking hands. The apology letter was a masterpiece, drafted by Rick himself, dripping with forced humility. Karen was required to hand-deliver it to every mailbox in the neighborhood, dressed in official HOA attire. Greg filmed the entire walk of shame from his kayak. He set the footage to Another One Bites the Dust and uploaded it to the neighborhood Facebook group. It hit 10,000 views by nightfall. But as satisfying as the lawsuit win was, the real checkmate was still coming. Because during all this chaos, the lake's owners had agreed to sell, finalizing paperwork that transferred ownership of the entire lake, its access points, and associated maintenance rights directly to me. I wired the funds, signed the documents, and received the deed in a plain manila envelope so unassuming it almost made me laugh. One signature, and the lake was mine. Karen didn't know it yet. The HOA didn't know it yet. But soon, very soon, they would wake up to a reality where every regulation, every nitpicky citation, every ounce of power they once wielded would vanish, because the lake they thought they controlled now answered to me and me alone. I stood at the water's edge the morning the lake officially became mine, the deed clutched in my hand like Excalibur pulled from the stone. It felt surreal, almost laughable, that all the pettiness, all the tyranny, all of Karen's ridiculous power trips had led to this moment. I didn't just win a petty feud. I didn't just outmaneuver Karen in court. I had taken her entire kingdom. I walked down my dock, and smiled as the wood creaked familiarly under my boots. I looked out at the calm expanse of water that stretched for acres in every direction. It wasn't just a lake anymore. It was my lake. Every boat, every fishing pole, every ripple belonged to me. And the first order of business was to make sure Karen and her cronies understood exactly what that meant. I didn't announce it immediately. No, that would have been too easy, too merciful. I wanted the reveal to have the kind of impact that echoed around the lake like a cannon shot. First, I had Rick send a polite but firm letter to the HOA board, notifying them that as the new owner of the lake, I would be reviewing all agreements pertaining to lake access and dock rights. Second, I installed a new sign at the community boat launch, a sleek black plaque with silver lettering that read, "Lake owned and operated by My Name Enterprises. Access by permission only." Short, sweet, devastating. The fallout was instant. My phone buzzed nonstop with texts, calls, and emails. Some neighbors were thrilled. They congratulated me, offered bourbon, begged to hear the full story. Others, especially Karen's old guard, were panicked. The HOA scrambled to call an emergency meeting. I agreed to attend, mostly because I wanted to see Karen's face when the penny dropped. The meeting was held in the clubhouse again, but this time the energy was completely different. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen, pale and twitchy, sat hunched at the far end of the table. Denise was nowhere to be found, probably hiding under a pile of designer throw pillows. When I walked in, conversations died mid-sentence. I carried a thick binder labeled simply New Lake Policies. I placed it on the table with a satisfying thud and took my seat at the head of the table, Karen's old seat. Rick spoke first. As of a date, my client is the sole owner of the body of water known as Lake Name. As such, all previous access agreements are hereby terminated pending renegotiation. He paused, letting the words sink in. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a trout gasping for air. Rick continued, residents wishing to continue using the lake for recreational purposes will need to sign new access agreements. Reasonable terms, nominal fees, compliance with basic safety standards. He smiled thinly, and a complete prohibition on unauthorized enforcement activities by the HOA. Translation, Karen couldn't even wag her finger at someone fishing too loudly without risking a ban. Someone, probably one of Karen's remaining loyalists, tried to argue that the HOA had traditional rights to the lake. Rick crushed that nonsense in under 2 minutes, citing the original deed, the expiration of the lease, and a glorious bit of legalese called exclusive riparian rights. By the end of it, even the most die-hard rule-huggers realized they had no ground to stand on. The lake and everything that touched it was mine. Karen, cornered, tried one last desperate move. "You're abusing your power," she screeched, slamming her fist on the table. I leaned back in my chair, utterly relaxed, and replied, "Karen, I didn't abuse power. I bought it fair and square. If you want to enjoy the lake, all you have to do is ask nicely. Something you've never been good at." The room erupted in snickers and poorly concealed laughter. Karen's face went beet red. In the days that followed, reality set in. Residents lined up to sign the new agreements. I waived the access fee for anyone who didn't have a history of filing frivolous HOA complaints. About 80% of the neighborhood qualified. Karen, however, found herself in a bind. Signing the agreement meant acknowledging my ownership, something her pride wouldn't allow. Refusing meant she couldn't legally launch a kayak, toss a fishing line, or even set foot on the community docks without risking trespassing charges. She tried to organize a boycott. It failed spectacularly when even her closest allies chose Saturday night pontoon parties over loyalty to a fallen tyrant. Steve, the guy with the inflatable flamingo, organized a Lake Freedom Day celebration, complete with fireworks, barbecue, and a live band playing yacht rock classics. I attended, naturally, sipping bourbon from a giant novelty goblet that said King of the Lake in gaudy gold letters. Every time someone toasted to the lake's liberation, I raised my glass a little higher. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghost. She stopped attending meetings, stopped sending angry emails, stopped glaring daggers at anyone who dared enjoy themselves. Rumor had it she was considering moving, but buyers weren't exactly lining up for a property known as Ground Zero for one of the biggest HOA defeats in state history. Owning the lake wasn't just about revenge, it was about freedom. About taking back the simple joys that people like Karen tried to regulate out of existence. Bonfires at sunset, kids skipping stones, couples paddling canoes under the stars. I didn't just save my own slice of paradise. I saved the spirit of the entire neighborhood. And the best part, I wasn't even done yet. After the dust settled for my announcement that I now owned a lake, the HOA crumbled faster than a sandcastle in a hurricane. The once feared, clipboard-wielding committee that had terrorized neighbors for years was now a hollow, splintered mess. Karen's former loyalists scattered like ants after a storm, suddenly developing selective amnesia about how tightly they'd once clung to her ridiculous regulations. Some even started claiming they had always thought the HOA was too controlling. Liars, the lot of them, but I let them squirm. Their desperation was almost comical. Denise, who had once been Karen's enforcer, sent me a handwritten letter asking if she could collaborate on future lake events. I laughed so hard reading it, I nearly spilled my drink. The HOA board, now down to a skeleton crew of 2 actual members and a few reluctant volunteers, tried to regain control. They hosted a community healing forum at the clubhouse, complete with bad coffee and even worse speeches about rebuilding trust. Only about 8 people showed up, and half of them were there for the free donuts. Karen didn't even attend. She had gone full hermit, blinds drawn, peeking out only occasionally like a groundhog terrified of its own shadow. Without the lake under their thumb, the HOA's leverage vanished. No one cared about their newsletters anymore. No one attended their mandatory meetings. When they sent out a limp survey asking how they could better serve the community, 90% of the responses simply said some version of "stay out of our lives." Even the people who once feared them realized they had nothing left to fear. I had effectively detonated the foundation they built their petty kingdom on, and it felt amazing. Rick, ever the shark, wasn't done either. As part of our lawsuit settlement, the HOA had been forced to pay not only my damages but also a chunk of Rick's fees. That financial hit, combined with a mass exodus of homeowners refusing to pay dues anymore, left their treasury gasping for air. They tried to implement emergency special assessments to raise funds, but nobody complied. Why would they? They had no carrots left to offer and no sticks to beat people with. Meanwhile, my reputation soared. Neighbors I barely knew started inviting me to backyard BBQs, boat parties, and late-night bonfires. Kids would wave at me from paddleboards, calling me Captain Freedom. Even local businesses caught on. The bait shop down the road offered me a lifetime discount. A nearby bar named a drink after me, the Doc Boss Special, a potent mix of bourbon and orange bitters. Every time I walked into town, people smiled, nodded, and whispered, "That's the guy who bought the lake." Karen, however, couldn't let it go. One afternoon, she tried her last desperate move. She had the audacity to send me a cease and desist letter, claiming that my ownership of the lake was in violation of neighborhood harmony agreements. I framed it and hung it on the wall of my office right next to her court-ordered apology letter. Rick laughed so hard he nearly passed out when he read it. We drafted a simple, savage response. "Dear Karen, please cease and desist from embarrassing yourself further." We mailed it with a bouquet of black roses. After that, Karen finally gave up. She quietly listed her house for sale, hoping to escape the wreckage of her own making. But selling wasn't easy. Word had spread far and wide about the lake war, and nobody wanted to buy into a neighborhood where you might become the next cautionary tale. Offers came in insultingly low, if they came at all. Eventually, she had to lower the asking price by nearly 20% just to get nibble. When the moving truck pulled away 6 months later, I toasted her departure with the entire neighborhood from the deck of Lake Escape. With Karen gone, the HOA finally collapsed. The remaining board members voted to dissolve the organization entirely, citing irreparable loss of community trust and unsustainable financial hardship. They filed the paperwork with the county, and just like that, the dreaded HOA was no more. The clubhouse was shuttered, the newsletters stopped, the fines disappeared. It was over. We were free. And me? I didn't just win. I ended them. I didn't just save my boat or my dock. I saved the lake, the spirit of the community, and the right to live without fear of petty tyranny. People started joking that I should run for mayor. Someone even printed up bumper stickers that said, "Our lake, our rules, thanks, my name." It felt good. Better than good. It felt right. Freedom wasn't just the absence of Karen. It was the presence of laughter, music, and lazy days spent floating under a wide-open sky. Freedom was kids jumping off docks without worrying if the splash violated some quiet enjoyment clause. Freedom was bonfires, fishing tournaments, floating movie nights, and yes, freedom was making sure no one like Karen could ever rise again. But this wasn't the end of the story. No, this was just the beginning. Because now that I owned the lake, I had bigger plans. Owning the lake wasn't just about winning against Karen. It was about building something bigger, something better, a floating kingdom where common sense ruled, not clipboards and angry form letters. With the HOA gone and the lake fully under my control, I set out to transform it into the kind of paradise that Karen and her ilk would have had nightmares about. First, I opened up Lake Escape Access Passes, a tongue-in-cheek system that let any neighbor in good standing, meaning basically anyone who wasn't Karen or a Karen wannabe, use the lake and its docks freely. The access fee was exactly $1 per year. Symbolic. Fun. Pure petty revenge. I even printed little laminated cards that said, "Proud member of the Free Lake Alliance." People wore them around their necks like VIP badges at a concert. Next came the events. Oh, the events. We launched Dakapalooza, a floating summer festival complete with live music, kayak races, barbecue cook-offs, and fishing tournaments with absurdly oversized trophies. Greg, the neighbor who helped film Karen's walk of shame, built a floating cinema screen out of PVC pipes and tarp. Saturday nights became movie on the lake night, where you could float in an inner tube with a beer while watching classics like Jaws and Pirates of the Caribbean. The best part? No permits needed. No noise complaints filed. No OA find sharks lurking in the bushes. Just laughter, water, and freedom. Kids who had once been told by Karen to play quietly or stay indoors were now kings and queens of paddleboards and skimming stones. Parents who used to get passive-aggressive HOA warnings about unsightly kayak storage now lined their docks with colorful fleets of canoes, paddleboards, and flamingo floats without fear. Someone even built a floating pizza oven on an old pontoon boat. It was chaos. It was wonderful. And the traditions we built. Legendary. Every 4th of July, we held the Freedom Float, a parade of decorated boats, rafts, and kayaks circling the lake, blasting music and tossing candy to kids. Halloween brought haunted paddle nights, where people decorated their boats like ghost ships and floated through fog machines set up on the water. Even winter had its charms. Ice skating on the shallows, carefully supervised, of course, and bonfires right on the frozen surface, with steaming mugs of cocoa passed around and campfire songs that echoed across the lake. The whole lake community thrived in ways no HOA regulation ever could have allowed. And yes, I kept a few mementos from the battle days. Karen's cease and desist letter stayed framed above my fireplace. The apology letter she had to distribute sat in a glass case on the wall of the floating clubhouse we eventually built, the dock house as everyone called it. Newcomers to the neighborhood were always told the full story, how the HO once ruled with an iron clipboard until one man said, "Not today," and bought the lake out from under them. I became a legend of sorts, known affectionately and a little bit ridiculously as the dock boss. And Karen, last we heard, she had moved to a tightly controlled gated community 3 counties away, where she could report her neighbors for non-compliant lawn gnome placement to her heart's content. I wished her well from very, very far away. Over time, I added new touches to the lake. Floating gardens, rentable fishing shacks, even a tiny island made of anchored pontoons where people could picnic or camp overnight. Every decision was made by open vote during dock house meetings, where the only rule was bring beer, bring ideas, and don't act like an HOA tyrant. The lake became a symbol, not just for us, but for neighboring communities too. We hosted visitors curious about how a neighborhood could run itself without crumbling into chaos. Turns out, when you trust people to be adults, they usually rise to the occasion. It wasn't about no rules. It was about no stupid rules. We enforced safety standards, kept the lake clean, and helped each other out, not because we were fined or threatened, but because it was our lake now. And me? I stayed exactly where I belonged, on my dock, drink in hand, feet kicked up, watching the sun set over a lake that used to be a battleground and was now a sanctuary. Sometimes I'd look out over the water and chuckle, remembering the absurd beginnings of it all. How one woman's pettiness led to the greatest accidental community revolution this lake had ever seen. I had one. But more importantly, we had one. Against small-mindedness. Against needless control. Against the soul-sucking bureaucracy that tried to turn paradise into a parking lot of rules. And all it took was a stolen boat, a stupidly bold move, and the absolute refusal to back down. Long live the dock boss. Long live the lake.